I have another comment. If you use timber to fulfill your goals in terms of reducing emissions, and this would, as Anastassia has demonstrated, will reduce rainfall, and then less rainfall, less forest, less carbon, basically. So you, in the end, you might actually be increasing your emissions in terms of carbon because of the water cycle. And this is happening everywhere, not only here in Europe, in South America as well. There is this work published in Nature by a colleague in the same department, showing that with airplane they go around and measuring very accurately CO2 distribution, and they made the connection. The drought years, the Amazon is a net source for CO2, and the wet years, the Amazon is a net sink for CO2. So as soon as you change the water status of those biomes, they start releasing carbon. So on the point of autism, you know, that or carbonocentric IPCC type of aims or objectives, you start using like biofuels, you know, like sugarcane and corn. They are producing ethanol, and you burn in your car. In the end, when you make the calculations, you will see that you are increasing your footprint in terms of impact in many respects. And this discussion is really, I don't know what Anastassia thinks about specifically on this connection of carbon and missing.
I think that many decisions concerning the use of wood are made in different contexts. As I said, in Russia, nobody is concerned about carbon. And I think that partly it is a healthy situation. Because, but at the same time, since we are not concerned at all about global ecological environmental problems, it is a bad thing. So, and what I think as a solution, the forest industry of the future should be like this. You should cut what you have grown on your plantation, and a total moratorium on cutting natural forests. So it should be at the level of the humanity, perhaps not the United Nations, but some other, what will be, and forestry should be industrial forestry, because we need wood, and should be natural forests that are allocated territory and like working mechanisms for us all. They regulate climate, the water cycle. So I see this as a solution. And it is not economically unfeasible, because when you grow, it is a matter of initial investments. Because when you grow close to the industrial centers, you don't spend money for transport. So if, for example, Europeans could help Russians, now we have these discussions about abandoned agricultural fields, because when our agriculture declined after the when Soviet Union dissolved, lots of fields just grew with forests. And now there is a discussion stimulated by Greenpeace, Russian Greenpeace, that we should give the official status of forest lands to these for agricultural and start forestry on them. And this is a good thing, but we need investors, and in parallel bans on cutting natural forests. Because if you don't do it in parallel, people will cut in both places. So we do need each other. I mean, Russia and the European Union, just like friends in one boat.
Through this cycle.
Yes, yes.
You suck water for us.
Yes, the forest. We share the same life-saving mechanism.
Okay. Well, if I may ask, because you mentioned the economic side, and you said the word that the idea needs investors. So, what would the investor, in your opinion, be able to get in exchange? You know, investing money into forest planting, and at the same time, that would be a planting forest for the commercial use and preserving the natural forest, or what was the idea?
That's the problem, because as it takes much time for the forest to grow, those who invest now into these plantations, they won't get wood anytime soon. So I think that perhaps they should be given some other
Reciprocity.
yes, some other reciprocity, but in any case we need some starting capital. Oh, so with forest you have to do with long-term investments,
Sure.
especially when you want to change the entire system. Because in Russia we just cut what naturally grows. So, and when you want to change the rails of such a big system, it does require initial inputs of money. I am not an economist at all.
No,
So,
He is.
I am.
yeah, yes, I understand.
Right,
So
right, answer
I'm
the-
ready.
the
I'm ready to learn.
Sure.
But
sure.
this is
That's why we are here, to learn from each other. And we have, as Hynek mentioned in the past, that Czech Republic, for example, these days suffers from, how do you call it, the planting or growing plants and crop for energy, not for food consumption, but you know, like the corn ends up in the bio energy electrical plants and so on, right? And same the planting of forests which grow fast, but they cut them quite young and again use them for biogas power plants.
with these agricultural fields, it is already more than 20 years. So there is already something there. So, and the situation now is absurd, because as far as these lands are classified as agriculture, those who own these lands are obliged to cut trees because they must be kept as fields. But these are people who don't have any experience in forestry often. So there is such strange situation.
There was an interesting visit we had a few months ago, I think, from
Korea.
South
Korea.
South Korea. There was a professor of
Professor Mu Yong-han, who is in charge of this water society in Korea, and he pushed the green. He works mostly for the cities, which means seepage of water, and the green roofs, and also the cycle of water in Korea, but they are close to the ocean.
If I may, what we learned from him is that it is possible to change the government mind,
And
because
law.
because he was instrumental in the movement that South Korea suffers from overbuilding, and at the same time they have floods, because there is a lot of concrete pavement and asphalt and everything. Of course, they've suffered from the monsoons and all these other things. So they said we need to have rooftop gardens to collect water and to keep it, and also so-called communal gardens, you know, around, so that not only preserves or keeps the water in place, but also brings it back a communal social life. People gather together and do something on a little fields and grow something. But back to what we learned from this professor, it was that it is possible that he told us that it was I think this May the South Korean government passed a decree or a law that the city planners were obliged to demand from the developers to have the rooftop systems catching water and creating a rooftop gardens as well as the others. So it is possible.
It was supported by the economical calculation.
Yeah.
That it is worth to do it.
Yeah, there was an interesting because he started his lecture with a very simple slide which said, "Rain is money for free." For free. Yeah, because rain you get if you get it, of course. I mean, it's interesting book.
I have one maybe connecting comment that in present, even though there are many Nobel Prizes awarded to economists who did see the ills of the present system that do not precify, does not give money value to environmental services from the biosphere. Still, the economic system is very resistant to accept it. This notion that you have to pay for a service that's provided. And when you say, intact forests, and this is the map produced by University of Maryland, is the best forest monitoring site. You can go there as Global Forest Watch. And you can see in red there is deforestation or losing. But you have also reforestation in blue. So it's a little bit mixed. Some places you will see there is a lot of plantation going on. But I want to call your attention to Finland and Sweden there. You see on the corner here. Those countries are taken as countries that have a very wise, developed forestry system. And what you see here is basically you have a kindergarten of forests using the notion that Anastassia brought to us. Because they keep cutting the forest and leaving it to regrowth, but you always have very baby trees there, and you cut again. Like the baby beef, have you ever enjoyed baby beef? Youngster cattle that before they are adults, they are slaughtered. But if you look there, and you see the Eurasian, you see the Russia, look at the Russian here. What is happening here? It's incredible. And when you look, and maybe I could show now
Sure.
yeah,
it's
because it's my time, all right. You will continue on Anastassia's discussion, the biotic pump, because it is, but if you look there in detail, you see that even Czech Republic is losing forests in the net, according with this data. And this is true for everywhere.
It's a satellite? Or
Satellite data is Landsat, 30 meters pixel.
Divide with Landsat, okay.
Yeah, and it's the best forestry data available, and they're monitoring since I think 2000. But if you look, for example, in Finland, and you look there and start zooming in, you will understand why the notion of forestry, Anastassia spoke about the industrial forest, and you have many places where you didn't have forests, and then you plant it and start growing like eucalyptus and pine, and producing timber, producing charcoal, producing all sorts of fiber for cellulose and fuel for burning. But as you go in a place where you did have forests, native, like in Russia, in Finland, you did have forests there. And you no longer, even though it's green, even though it's productive, you have a lot of timber being produced there, but it's not coming. Oh, here you go. You see that all the blue is regrowing in this period from 2000 to 2016. It's a 16-year period where this colors are telling you. And it's completely, it's like being eaten up and then left to regrow, which is good on one hand, different from many areas like in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia, where it's not left to regrow. It's completely substituted by agriculture and other uses and cattle ranching, etc. But this is, you cannot say that this is a functional, in terms of climate, of the biotic pump, is a functional forest as the preserved areas in Russia, right? That's the bottom line here. That's the take-home sort of message. Forestry is not something that you can count on in terms of climate services. You might have forests growing there; they're important, but not the way that. I will now show you a quick presentation I prepared. If I can see, maybe I am growing old because I can't see here. It's too small. Okay, here you go. Well, this is, I start my presentation talking about this that Anastassia mentioned, this article in a site, the convergence on the biotic pump, without mentioning the biotic pump. But forests emerge as a major overlooked climate factor. New work at the intersection of atmospheric science and ecology is finding that forests can influence rainfall and climate from across the continent. This article ends with this quote from Ines Fang, who is a well-known, well-regarded hydrologist from Rutgers. The developments in this new research area demonstrate that future climate scientists will need to master two fields that have, for more than a century, been largely separate: atmospheric physics and biology. Okay, and this is an article that quotes Douglas, quotes me, but doesn't quote the authors of the biotic pump, which shows that exactly what Anastassia was telling us in the interval, that there is an uneasiness in the field, so to speak. The biotic pump is so incredibly powerful in terms of its arguments that many people say, yeah, I can't go against it, but instead of just giving the credit and say, okay, this is right and let's go all together, no, people are trying to find a spot under the sun to say, oh, we found an explanation, and that's the status of the business in the academia right now. So we are losing trees everywhere in the world. Compared to the original forest cover, original I mean before 200 years ago, we lost more than 50% of all the global forests. If you think about just CO2, the 290 ppm concentration before the industrial age, it had a lot to do with the fact that you had green, beings taking out CO2, and there is an equilibrium between concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and the way the biosphere deals with it, growing, photosynthesis. Now, we have just 25% of tree cover and 75% of non-tree in the world. If you look Brazil, in the last 16 years, we lost 50 million hectares of forest. This permanent loss, okay? 50 million hectares. And it's accelerating. it's accelerating the deforestation, it's accelerating the forest degradation, which is, I call the green deserts, are places where timber loggers go and they take the big trees, and the big trees are very important in a functional forest because they tender the youngsters. There is a phenomena called hydraulic retranslocation, where big mother trees, they have deep tap roots, and they pump water during the dry season. During the day, they suck all the water out into the atmosphere. During the night, the superficial root system release water to the youngsters. You know, the water that is keep on going up from deep down below is released to the youngsters. So a functional forest has to have the mother trees there, the big, large trees. They're very important because they keep all the youngsters coming. If you go there like they do and chop off all the large trees and they leave the youngsters there, then you start getting a degrading forest for a number of reasons. We can't go into detail now, but basically you change the microclimate. You open up the canopy, up to 60% damage in the upper canopy, and then you produce huge tracts of degraded land. So the 50 million hectares that we lost in the last 16 years in Brazil alone, you can see in the South America map, it's happening everywhere. Now it's starting faster in Colombia since the guerrilla, Adriana is from Colombia, since they made the peace treaty. That was a war declaration against the forest because the guerrillas, they were protecting the forest in Colombia. Nobody wanted to go there because it was dangerous. Now that the peace treaty was reached, the deforestation exploded in Colombia, of course in Venezuela, Peru, and Bolivia as well. But in Brazil, you're talking about 50 million hectares of clear cut, shaved, you know, like your beard, shaved. And then you have another twice as much as degradation. So the loss of forest is so powerful. The loss of the biotic pump is so powerful. Climate is changing already. We have gone through the tipping point. We have already crossed the tipping point. And what had been predicted many years ago by one of the Nobre families, not Paulo, not me, this was Carlos, the older brother, who is climatologist, and he sat in the IPCC, etc. 2004, they published a paper about the hypothesis called savanization. That they ran climate models, numerical models, and they showed that the vegetation climate equilibrium, according with the way those models see it, could jump to another state. You know, from wet, that is now, or it was, to a semi-dry, and eventually a savanna. This is already happening. You know, it's on the news. It's no longer science. That's why I think we can shortcut the slow, as Anastassia had pointed, the slow scientific maturation process, because now the news are doing this for us. We don't have to make anybody believe it. Just watch the news. And so every 5 years, since 2005, we have massive droughts in the Amazon. Massive, massive. And then you have massive tree mortality as well. And as you have tree mortality, you have fuel for next year, a new cycle of fire breaking in the Green Ocean. I will talk about the Green Ocean tomorrow in my talk. And then you start losing. Because, and not that this system couldn't be stopped. The problem is that you have people there doing it, stopping, and they're unstoppable. They got power, political power, and this is not only here. It's in Congo. It's in everywhere. In Indonesia, it's in Russia somehow. The people say we need to use this resource. Go back to economy. We need to use the resource. How can we excuse not to use it? It's money. You can't go above without it. So savanization is already. This is the deforestation in the last 10 years in red. So as you can see, we are losing it. We are losing it. And we are suffering already. You know, we had this massive, in 2014, Adriana was the major senior hydrologist running models to see when the water for the metropolitan São Paulo. You probably know São Paulo is the third largest metropolitan zone. 22 million people live in metropolitan São Paulo. And we almost ran, like the Cidade do Cabo, Cape Town. Cape Town last year, or this year. Was this year? Yeah, it is happening everywhere. We almost ran out of water. This is what Adriana was saying. If it doesn't rain in the next 30 days, it's over. We completely dry, 22 million people. The army started to assemble to protect the infrastructure from upheaval. So losing forests, losing water, changing climate, we will end up in chaos, social upheaval. This is the kind of thing that it hasn't yet, the click that we are going into a major chaos out of this is not yet in many mindsets, especially in government. This is the Czech Republic. You see, you lost, according with this data, loss mean you subtract the amount of trees that have been cut and the trees that grow back in the 16 years, 243,000 hectares of forest net loss in the Czech Republic. You could go on and on. This is the overall data. 337 million hectares have been lost in the 16 years. And you see that Russia is the first one with 5.3 million hectares. Brazil comes right after. I never saw that we would be competing on more than scientific subjects.
Nobody's talking about it.
Nobody's talking about this.
Amazonia, but not about Russia.
No, exactly. But you saw the picture there. It's massive deforestation in Russia. Then United States. Did you know that the United States was deforesting?
And I was surprised that you showed on your map, I live in Florida. You shown this.
Well, but Florida is regrowing because there is a lot of plantations there. Yeah, Florida, Carolinas, and Georgia.
A lot of loss also.
A lot of loss as well. And then Indonesia, China. You see, China is almost none. And
So they are going to Russia.
And they're going to cut Russia, and they're planting like crazy. And that's the thing. And then the others, 15 million hectares. You see, just this is in 2017 alone. So the situation for forests worldwide is dire, really, completely chaos, because we are losing the very fabric that help us keep a stable climate. Now, of course, many governments are realizing that this is happening. So let's respond to it, like China did. Massive scale afforestation projects. And like in Africa, you have this 7,000 kilometers long green wall. China started 20, 30 years ago, their green wall. And if we look this in detail, you realize that planting trees does not guarantee forest establishment. And for China, you see that the red dots there are the decreasing rainfall, and the blue dots are increasing rainfall. Of course, if you increase rainfall in the Gobi Desert, just for a tiny amount, it will appear blue here, but it doesn't really mean much in terms of changing But just in two papers that analyze the China story, the conclusions are, if you reforest, like they call it, excessive reforestation. How could reforestation be excessive? When you look to the water story, you come to this lowest plateau, which is right besides the Gobi to the south. It's far from the ocean. And they have successfully reestablished forests there. You know, the lowest plateau 20 years ago was a totally wasteland. enormous erosion, the droughts, and not productive. And now, at one time, I think they were starting exporting apples and pears, massive production of fruits. And they recovered the landscape. It was really impressive. You can go into YouTube and learn about this. But they realized that the rivers start drying up. And this work showed that the trees, what the trees are doing, they're pumping water from the ground into the atmosphere and losing it. Exactly what Anastassia had said.
New forest does it.
Yeah, it's very effective.
It's the same as Amudarya and Siberia. It's the same, only in modern
Yes,
era.
exactly. So trees
Same mistake.
Trees is, I call it, a irrigator in reverse. When we make a sprinkler to irrigate land for agriculture, you are wetting the land like a watering can. Trees are irrigating in reverse and sending up and moistening the atmosphere. If the wind blows in the wrong direction, you lose that moisture. So you will see that in hydrological literature, there are many confusing fights about this, because some people, like the guy from Holland, published a key paper in Science several years back saying that trees are bad for the water cycle. Conclusion, you remember that paper. Conclusion, hydrologist. But a hydrologist that looks only from the canopy down. And basically it says, trees take water from the ground. Water from the ground that goes through the tree will not run off to rivers, and therefore you lose that water. But then there is another, in China case, you know, you mentioned a number. Actually, the number that China planted, it's a little bit bigger than the number you mentioned, 800,000 square kilometers. This is the amount of trees that have been chopped off in Brazil during the last 40 years. Okay, China has planted in the last 25 years. So it's really massive, $100 billion investment in reforesting. From which, according with a study done by this guy here, Arends, only 15% took hold, or only 15% of this area has become a forest, as defined by FAO, a 5 meters high vegetation with at least 30% closure in the canopy. Okay, only 15%. Why? Because China doesn't know about the biotic pump. So they're just planting trees. Now they have put army to plant trees. And they are incredible because they march forward. No, like Mao. It's a march forward. And they don't have to go through election every 4 years. And they just decide to do it, and they do it, which is great on one hand. But on the other hand, as in the conclusion here, land hydration by ocean is a required condition for establishment of a continental forest that can sustain itself and become permanent. That's what we have learned with the work that Victor and Anastassia have done. So, conclusion, the baseline. You can do things like China did. And this long green wall in Africa is the same thing, to hold back the desert. But how is it coupled with the surrounding oceans? How the atmospheric part of it? You know, as I say here, there is a lack of atmospheric planning in those projects, because they all basically say plant trees, plant trees. In Senegal, it's a disaster. They have got funding from the UN, I think, or the World Bank, to plant billions of trees. They have planted millions or several millions, and they lost almost everything for fuel wood. As the trees start growing, they chop off for fuel wood, you know, to burn it. So if you don't take the human factor into account, or if you plant trees in a place where you have camels, for example, you know, they will browse on those trees and it's gone. So reestablishing forests is, as forests themselves are, complex business. One cannot be naive, and one cannot be, superficial. Yeah, you have to be really conscious about all this, these issues. Desert greening, just to close my presentation here. Desert greening is the holy grail of forest restoration. Because the deserts, as you can see here, this is Saudi Arabia in 1987 here, and there the last image in 2012. Saudi Arabia has been able to export wheat from, it was I think the second world producer of wheat from a desert. Saudi Arabia has not been desert forever. 11,000 years ago, Saudi Arabia had forests and savannas, and the rock paintings you go in Saudi Arabia, you see big vertebrates like the tooth saber lion and giraffes, etc. And what happened there? It's a long story. Maybe Anastassia will be better able to tell you. But the story here, what is happening? They are greening. You see, desert greening right there with wheat. Using what kind of water? No, not seawater. Underground. They are pumping the aquifer in in Arabia the same way they pumped oil. It's a fossil store of water, the same way oil is there. It's 15,000 years water there. And what is happening? If you go in the Google Earth, you can do this. This is a nice, you see white discs, completely white. White discs. You know the pivot central irrigation? Completely white. You know what the white is? Salt. Because any place where you have more evaporation than precipitation, salt is left behind when the water evaporates, and then the system becomes, you produce a crust of salt. I think in Central Asia, this project Ural Sea happened similar, where they are growing cotton, and eventually everything started becoming silent. Yeah, in Kazakhstan. And so, this is completely unsustainable. Completely. And Saudi Arabia did it as if there were no tomorrow. Why they did this? Because this made sense economically. You know, you bore a hole here, you got water, and you can grow wheat in the desert. And it's short-lived, it's already almost gone. So this is not a good idea. This map shows by Ahrens, the same guy who did this study in China, showing the potential area for reforestation in the world in terms of being most suitable or least suitable, and where do you have the forest now. What you see right away is that the most suitable area from natural climate, without using technology, are the areas right next to the big forests. Why would that be? I mean, this is almost, best potential happens contiguous to forest or under a climatic influence. You know, the red areas. You will see all of them have the moist winds coming from the forests, and that's the place that you want to use. However, all those places, you have competition with agriculture, because that's where also you have the best potential for growing crops and produce food and produce all the goods that agriculture can produce. So when you think about a strategy to recover climate basing on the biotic pump and the forests, you want to go on the gray area here, the deserts. You want to recover the arid zones, because the other areas you will compete with other uses when you have still good rain. So the arid zone make up huge areas available for reforestation that will not compete with agriculture. And most of those areas have had forests somewhere in time. So which is a good indication that the Earth system does not forbid to have areas that are today dry from becoming green again, right? And even in China, even though their success rate is really low, some of the areas they managed. For example, there is a big project there where they were able to stabilize dunes, sand dunes, using shrubs. And they put, but the Chinese people are so many that they can put someone go there and water each plant. It has a different person to take care of. One time I was going from the airport to my institute in the institution car, and there was a Chinese guy. Brazil has a collaboration with China in remote sensing satellite, and he was asking, Antonio, why Brazil is losing so much forests? I said, well, because people go there for timber, for whatever. He said, if it were in China and the government decided to protect, it would put a soldier right beside each tree with a gun and would protect it. I said, yeah, you have 1 billion people, you can afford to do this. You cannot actually, because we have 400 billion trees in the Amazon still. But this notion that once a government wants to do something, it can do it, is a notion that we should probably... I want to finish this talk with this Native American prophecy. And this is a nice inspiration for our group. They call the Warriors of the Rainbow. When the earth is ravaged and animals are dying, a new tribe of people shall come onto earth from many colors, classes, creeds, and who by their actions and deeds shall make the earth green again. They will be known as the Warriors of the Rainbow.